Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about the Old Testament timeline. Just pretty exciting. I know on our main webpage we have a basic overview of this. I'd like to give a little more information and details on what we have in front of us here and how to use it when you're reading. All right, so you're going to start with the numbers underneath. You've got 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, etc. We're using BC, um, before Christ. If you're in modern archaeology, they use the term BCE, which stands for before the Common Era, which I think you're going to find it's the same thing. Um, modern archaeology wants to remove any religious references to their dating on the numbers. Um, be that as it may, the numbers are the same. So if you hear BCE, just know that's the same as BC. If you're into archaeology or if you get into that, you'll understand where that all is coming from. All right. So our narrative in the scriptures begins in the book of Genesis, with the story of creation and Adam and Eve. And then it moves forward to Noah, which happened about 1,000 years after that with the flood. All right. And then after that, we have the story of Abraham and his descendants. Now, this is a really key moment here with Abraham because he had two sons. Abraham had Ishmael first, but with his servant. Ishmael is what we know as the father of the Arab nations today. So, anybody who's of Arabic descent that is not Jewish, Abraham was their dad. Okay, so their main descendant. And then Abraham's son through his wife is Isaac. And Isaac had Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons that eventually became tribes because they grew so much. Um, and then Ishmael also had 12 tribes of descendants that became kings and nations. And if you know about all the Arab nations in the Middle East today, they became pretty great nations themselves. And so the conflict that we are seeing today in the news right now is directly connected to the events that happened here in 2000 BC. We do get into that in quite a bit of detail in our covenant study here. Um, so I will just kind of leave that point there. But just know that the Jewish people's beginning started at 2000, but also the Arab nations began at 2000, and what those conflicts are all about. Apologize for that. I'm not sure how to turn off notifications for that from popping up on my computer as we go here. All right, so now we're at Moses. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's son Joseph ended up in Egypt, right? That whole story about the color, the multicolored coat in his dreams, that his brothers hated him and sold him into slavery, and so he ends up in Egypt. And then because he can interpret dreams, now he's the second in command of Egypt, and there's a big famine and all the things. So eventually, his brothers and their families and his dad end up down in Egypt. But once the Pharaoh died, who didn't know Joseph and that whole backstory, the Jewish people ended up being enslaved for 400 years. So you can see how that would have happened. So about 100 years after Abraham, that whole stuff went down, and now his descendants are slaves in Egypt, what God actually predicted was going to happen when he talked with Abraham. I think it's in chapter 15 of Genesis. We do get into that and all of the ramifications for that in our covenant study. So then the Lord raises up Moses, and through a lot of miraculous things, rescues the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. And they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and the Lord brings them up there. And then when Moses passes away, Joshua takes over command and helps them go into the land and settle. Now, by this time, the 12 tribes have become huge. I mean, there's several million people in this situation. And God took the land of Israel and gave specific spots for each of the 12 tribes to settle in and to live and enjoy and to dwell in the land in peace and safety. But there's a catch. They will have peace and safety as long as they remain faithful to the Lord Himself. Don't worship the pagan gods. Don't follow their ways. Don't get involved in the immoral activities that happen in the pagan temples. And there you go. So the question is, were they obedient? Hmm. So at this point, this takes us to once they've settled in the land, they've conquered most of the territories that they were told to, not all of them. Again, we'll get into the map on that, and we'll get into what they were successful at and what they were unsuccessful at in completing their mission. Um, we'll get into that in our covenant study. Okay, so when we're at 1100, this is the time of the judges. So at this time period, the 12 tribes are in their different areas in the land. They're governing themselves. If there was a problem raised up, the other tribes come and help. At least they're supposed to, and really bad consequences if they don't. And so you've got God would raise up a judge here or there as needed to help with wise counsel, to help with military strategies if they're being invaded, um, redirect them if they're getting into some immoral things and practicing things they shouldn't be and forgetting the God of the heavens. So examples of judges would be Gideon or Samson or even Deborah. And so again, this is the time of when the tribes are running things on their own and have autonomy, and God is their main source of wisdom and leadership. Okay, it's called a theocracy. Theo meaning God, so that God is their main leader. Okay, with help from supernaturally empowered human beings as needed. All right, so moving into that, eventually the tribes get to a point where they're saying, we really wish we had a physical human being king who could rule us so we could be like the other nations, because that would help us come together as a people and we wouldn't be as vulnerable to outside nations that want to come in and mess with us and conquer us and take our food that we work hard to raise and all the things. And so at 1,000, this is the time where the kings begin. King Saul is the first king that God raised up. He selected. Not the best person. He had a lot of character issues. He was a people pleaser. He was afraid of the people. He did not understand that there is actually a separation of church and state that was required. Like he tried to act in position of high priest on several occasions. When God gave him specific directives with the military, he was he did the military part of it, but uh, didn't follow the directions completely and made altars to himself to celebrate his accomplishments without acknowledging God's hand and things. He was just yeah, yeah, he didn't honor the Lord, and he wasn't obedient in all the ways that he needed to be, and that caused issues. We get into that in more detail in our covenant study. And David is the next king that God raises up. And then David, pretty much a rock star. He was a warrior, poet, prophet, musician, and eventually king. He also had some moral issues, as I'm sure you may be aware. If not, read about David. He's got an interesting life story. And then David's son Solomon was king after that, so that followed the family line. Solomon was known for wisdom and wealth and was pretty amazing. Yeah, I just heard recently that if you took the two most wealthy human beings on the planet right now, Elon Musk being one of them, if you put their wealth together, multiply that number by 10, then you might be close to the amount of money that Solomon was able to gather for himself. Like he was unbelievably wealthy, the wealthiest king that has ever lived in human history ever, even to this day. Um, so, and he was known for wisdom. There were, kings from all over would come and seek his counsel. Cleopatra was well known for coming up and speaking with him about things. Yeah, so pretty wild stuff. When Solomon died, this is where things get really messy. Okay, so Solomon's son, Rehoboam, which you may see his name in the gray box underneath 1,000, Rehoboam was the legitimate next in line to be king. Um, and there's a crazy story where right before his coronation, all the 12 tribes gather in Jerusalem, which is the capital city. Um, and the tribes come to him and say, "Hey, like, your dad was an amazing king, but boy, he taxed us like crazy. He worked us on all these royal projects like crazy. And we just need to know, are you going to be as rough on us as your dad, or are you going to lighten up a little bit here? Like, you got plenty of wealth, so you don't need to keep beating the crap out of us, you know?" And so Rehoboam says, "Give me a minute to have counsel with my advisors, and I'll get back to you." So he goes and he has two different groups of advisors. One group is the older guys that advised his dad, and then there was the group of the younger guys that were like his buddies. Okay, so the older guys were like, "Look, what? Just tell them what they want to hear, and go through the coronation. They're going to swear fealty as their king for you, and then you can do whatever you like. But it's important to get them to swear fealty to you." Like, okay, that's a fair point. Then he goes over to his young advisors, his buddies, and they're like, "You can't let these people push you around. You're their king. Who do they think they are telling you how to be king? You tell them, like, you think my dad was bad, I'm going to be worse." Whose advice would you listen to? So whose advice do you think Rehoboam listened to? He listened to his younger guys, and so when he went back to people, he says, "You know, my father beat you with whips. I'm going to sting you with scorpions," that kind of thing. Um, Trying to establish, I'm not a king you can push around, and I am the rightful heir, which he was correct, but as a result of this, 10 of the tribes are like, "Yeah, bro, we out. We out of here." And so they defected and they refused to swear fealty to Rehoboam as their king. And Jeroboam, you'll see the gray box on the top there, over top of the orange box that says North Falls. Jeroboam was the general of the army. He says, "Hey, if you make me your king, you can live your life however you want, and life will be great. No more beating with whips and all the things. You can just do what you want whenever you want, and I'll make sure that happens for you." And so 10 of the 12 tribes, that's exactly what they did. Two tribes remained faithful: the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah, and the priestly tribe of the Levites remained also in the south. And the capital city of Jerusalem is more in the southern, like, it's pretty central. And so what ended up happening is Jeroboam closed the border so that people in the 10 tribes that were in the north could not travel south to Jerusalem, which is the capital city, where the temple is. Now, why would he do that? Well, who else lives in Jerusalem? The king. So Jeroboam closed the border, preventing people from worshiping the true God of the heavens because he didn't want them returning to their king. And instead, he went way up on the north, like the northern border, okay, in Banyas, and set up this altar with a golden cow and said, "This is the God that rescued you out of Egypt, and you're going to just worship that God here." Does that sound familiar? Do you guys remember any other incidences in the Bible where there's a golden cow that people are worshiping instead of the God of the heavens? Yeah. As a direct result of this event with Jeroboam, the 10 northern tribes fell pretty quickly into worshiping false gods and pagan practices. And the reason for that is in Middle Eastern, well, not just even Middle Eastern, I think it's just the ancient days, they had a belief system that you worship the god in order to get whatever it is that they're known for. And particularly in those days, they worshiped the gods of fertility, trusting for water, their crops, and children. Excuse me. Mm. And so what ends up happening here? is they end up worshiping and trusting these false gods for their provision rather than the God of the heavens. And God said, hey, listen, if you do that, I'm taking my hands of protection off, and you want to trust these false gods for these things? We'll see how that goes for you, because I'm not going to provide for you in that way if that's what you're doing. You trust those things, let's see how well they provide for you. And it just became a mess. There was always a remnant of people, because the the voice of the many is not always the voice of everyone, right? And so there was always a remnant that remained faithful, but the vast majority of people here end up turning to ungodly ways and immoral practices, following the pagan gods and goddesses. And we get into more of that in the covenant study. But this is just at least to give you context of what's going on here. And so you'll see the orange box at 722, the north falls to Assyria. And if you know your history, which is what we're working on here, the capital city of Assyria is Nineveh. Now, some of you are like, wait a minute, I know the name of that city. For those of you who know your Bible stories, the book of Jonah is all about sending the gospel message to Nineveh, which was the capital city of Assyria, which is the nation that God used to bring judgment on the Jewish people. So you can understand now maybe why Jonah did not have the best attitude about this. You want me to go where and do what? To who? Yeah. Jonah initially was not a fan, not a fan of God's plan, clearly. And you see he has this bad attitude through the whole book. What I learned recently was that Jonah actually did have a change of heart. Then the nation of Nineveh, well, the city of Nineveh and the nation did repent, did have a humble heart of um, repentance with the Lord, at least for a time. And Jonah actually lived in the city of Nineveh and continued to minister there. So I know where the book of Jonah ends, he's still got a bad attitude. But the reason we know Jonah actually stuck around is there's a tomb for Jonah in the ancient Nineveh that was destroyed recently by some radical Islamic people that wanted to erase the memory of Jonah being there. But there is archaeological evidence that Jonah remained and ministered and witnessed to the city of Gentiles who were very vicious and aggressive. So just I just find that so interesting to know that. And so the major prophet that is that was writing warnings here for the northern 10 tribes right before they were conquered was Isaiah. The main theme of his book is like, hey, there is judgment coming for all of the things that have happened, but also there is promise of God restoring you and that there's a Messiah coming who is going to redeem you. And so specifically Isaiah 53 is where 53 and 54 is a lot about the Messiah, the suffering servant who is going to come, but also the restoration of the nation of Israel at some point. Okay. The southern two tribes that remained loyal to Rehoboam, Judah and Benjamin, and the priestly tribe of the Levites, they got to stay in the south. They got to continue having the temple and worshiping God there. But eventually they too fall into immoral practices with the false gods. Molech, Baal, Asherah, those are the main three, but there are others that they got involved with. And so you'll see Jeremiah there with an arrow pointing towards 586. He was the last prophet for the nation of Judah before they were also conquered. And so the northern Assyria, I forgot to mention, that's today Iran. And if you follow the news at all, you'll know that Iran is still giving the nation of Israel trouble today, right now, like literally right now in this moment as I'm recording this. There are issues. Um, And so Iran takes out the northern 10 tribes, otherwise known as Assyria. The south falls at 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire, which is modern day Iraq. So it's a little further over. And the king there is Nebuchadnezzar, which some of you may be familiar with that name. Um, and so the southern tribes are captured and removed and taken to the Babylonian Empire and are put into exile, and no one is allowed to live in the land of Israel for 70 years. Okay, some biblical names that you may be familiar with: Daniel. This all happens right at that time frame, and also Ezekiel. Ezekiel came to the land of Babylon a little later, just a few years later than Daniel. There were three waves of deportation to Babylon. Daniel was in the first wave. We get into a lot of these details in our Daniel study. But just know that Daniel, because he was royalty, he was a direct descendant of Hezekiah. He was a young, brilliant, uh, royal young man, and his three buddies, Azariah, Mishael, and oh my goodness, of course my brain forgets the names. You know what I'm talking about. We talk about them in their Babylonian renames, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but those weren't their original names. Anyway, this is where we find ourselves in the 70 years of exile. Eventually, in 516, the people are allowed to start returning to the land. The Medo-Persian Empire had taken over, and he was a much more understanding emperor, and that's where you find things. Now, this takes us to now, if you see the navy blue box, it says 400 silent years, no prophets. So this is another 400 year time period. The Jewish people are allowed to return to the land. They are resettling the land, but they weren't. The Medo-Persians were allowing them to be there, but you're not allowed to build big walls around your major cities to, like that's a military thing. So you can be there, but you can't, yeah, you can't build a military and you can't whatever. But in 444 BC, we find in the book of Nehemiah that they were then given the ability to, they're given the command that they were allowed to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem to protect themselves and begin rebuilding the temple, the Jewish temple to the God of creation there. Which is a really key moment. And again, when we are studying in the book of Daniel, there's a specific prophecy in the ninth chapter that goes into that. That starts the clock ticking to knowing when the Messiah is actually supposed to show up on the scene to the day. I'm going to leave that as a teaser. And so when you get into the book of Daniel study, by the time we get to chapter 9, we'll unpack all of that. It's pretty detailed, and quite frankly, it's a lot of fun. All right. And then fast forward to 333 BC. The Greeks at this point are the major world superpower. Think Alexander the Great. And there's a lot that happens here. The Hellenized Greek thinking process and education process gets introduced in the Jewish community. And again, when we're doing the book of Daniel, we get into the implications on that and how that's directly connected to the biblical covenants. So this 400 silent years is a testing time for the Jewish people. Are you going to get back into paganism, or are you going to remain faithful to the God of the heavens? And to their credit, they don't. They don't go back into idolatry. They learned their lesson. There's no evidence at this point that they were doing any kind of pagan practice, so that was huge. However, the Greek Hellenized thought process of ego and philosophy, this is very much permeating the Jewish people and their thinking and their education. Um, and so being more concerned with political intrigue and political structuring rather than relationship with the God of heaven, that's actually where things go a little sideways here. And that is the predominant issue that Jesus is addressing when he's here the first time with the religious leaders. You have all these rules for these people, but you have forgotten the heart of God. You're not worshiping, so Jesus comes in and he reframes, if you look at the Mount of Beatitudes, what his sermon is about that, and a lot of his interactions with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Jesus' addressing of these religious leaders is addressing, he's reframing your understanding of what idolatry actually is. And it's not just about following false gods and immoral actions there, but it has to do with a relationship and um, understanding God's heart. So we'll be getting into more of that, but just understand the influence of the Greek philosophies and the Greek culture here at 333. That drastically shifts the culture and influences things. Okay, and then with 63 BC, that's where the Roman Empire takes over, and road building and the occupation of the nation of Israel. That's where all of this gets a little hairy. But again, um, one of the really interesting things was God totally used the Romans against themselves because it was a setup. And the reason is, when the gospel message was ready, after Jesus had done his ministry and all the things, you've got the disciples and you've got the apostle Paul ready to go. It made it very easy to spread the gospel message to the nations of the day because they had roads to travel on. Travel and commerce between cities all over the known world at that time was relatively easy compared to what it had been just 100 years before that, because there were roads, and it was and the common language of Latin. It was Greek and now it was Latin. The common trade languages between all the cities, it made it easy to communicate this message. And so we've got some pretty interesting things happening here. Now, the reason we end the Old Testament timeline with John the Baptist is because he's the last prophet before the Messiah shows up on the scene. And they hadn't had a prophet for over 400 years. And finally, there's a guy out in the wilderness screaming about, hey, kingdom of heaven's coming, prepare yourself. Messiah's coming, prepare yourself. And this is where you find when John's out baptizing in the Jordan River in the middle of the hot desert area, you've got the Pharisees and Sadducees from Jerusalem coming out to examine him and saying, like, okay, man, are you the guy? Are you the Messiah? And John actually quotes the book of Isaiah to them, and they don't pick up what he threw down. He's like, no, I'm not the guy. I'm the one that's coming in the spirit of Elijah. I'm not actually Elijah, obviously, but I'm coming in the spirit of Elijah, and I'm here to proclaim and give you warning bells, bing, 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 that the real guy is coming, and he was. So, with that, we're going to complete our Old Testament timeline here. I'm going to pause here and, excuse me, give you a moment to collect yourself, and then we'll get to the New Testament timeline here in just a moment.